Hi, and welcome to the lecture where we're going to talk about primitives, mesh mode and polygon mode, and determine what the difference is between all of those things. Hopefully this will clarify it for you. So let's get right in there and start. So let's create our obligatory box like we have done for previous lectures. So just create one box here like so. Got a second box here like so, and we'll create a third box here like so. Okay, so now all of these are primitives. Let's just try and snap off by pressing S. Go to where we want to come out of box mode, click that, select the first one, turn on my edges. Right, so all of these at the current time are primitives. I'm going to change their colors so I can see what I'm doing here. You can choose your own colors, of course, but it's just so I can see my edges like before. There we go. Right, so what is a primitive? A primitive basically is a set shape. You can't do a lot of primitives. It just allows you to create a basic shape in Max. For example, I can create a sphere. That's a primitive. I can create a cylinder. That's a primitive. But if I go to modify, there's not a lot I can do to it beyond creating a primitive. I can change the number of edges and sides of the primitive. For example, I can bring it down to 3 over here. You can see the parameters of each of the objects, and I can increase that to give it higher density. I can give it more height segments, so I can make the resolution of the polygons a lot higher, make it smoother, and start off with a higher resolution object if I wish. That's pretty much it. There's not a lot more you can do to it, and it's the same with each one, like this sphere here, for example. Use our transform move. So this sphere, I can modify this, and I can change the number of segments to make it really low poly, or I can increase it to make it much denser. I can change the radius so it's bigger, smaller, and basic modifications on a primitive, nothing more than that. Let's delete this and let's delete that. So we'll leave this first box as a primitive, so you can see I can change, I can change the number of length segments and width segments and height segments. Beyond that, there's not a lot more you can do with primitives, but it gives you a good baseline for starting your models. So polygon mode, which we've used quite a lot, there's another way of changing this to a poly object. Over here in your modifiers tab, you may or may not have edit poly there, but I rarely use that, so just right click, come out to edit poly, and you'll see it changes. Now suddenly under the modify tab, you have all these options now to modify this object. And if you select one of your modes like vertex, edge, you can go in at that level. So you've seen me do this already, so I can extrude. I can extrude. I can't do that with this object, but at the same time now I've lost the parameters for my primitive, but I don't really need them. Once you get into poly mode, you don't need those parameters. So that's really the difference between those two. That's basic. Lets you set it up, and then you convert it to poly mode to edit it. That's essentially the difference. And then you have mesh mode. So I'm going to convert this into, you can see, editable mesh. Okay, now editable mesh on the surface looks like editable poly, But editable mesh is kind of a legacy feature in Max. You know, it's what we used to do. We used to edit the mesh, and you can still go in at the same sort of level as edit polygon, but you lose all these lovely tools. I come into mesh mode sometimes if I want to edit the actual mesh on a mesh level. You've got to be really careful doing that, because you can screw up your polygon object. It will change the edges and things on it. So unless you really have to, or you know, I would ignore mesh mode, quite frankly. I rarely go into it these days, and you don't really have to. You don't really have to go into it and start using it. You know, poly mode is it's perfectly adequate, and you can build pretty much anything, and it has all the features in polygon mode. Edit mesh mode has. So edit mesh mode lets you go deep into it, and you can change in if you go to object properties, turn off edges. See, it's all triangle still, but in edit mesh mode, it lets you edit even the invisible edges, which polygon mode doesn't let you do, because you're working purely in quads in polygon mode, and that's fine because you want that nice topology. But in mesh mode, you can work on a triangle level. You can even remember in a previous lecture I changed all my invisible edges to visible, so they all became triangles. Well, this is how I did it. I came in here in mesh mode, select the edges, I went down to the bottom, and surface properties, you've got this visible tab. You can make it visible, and now it's become an edge. So I can go back, turn this on again, and you know, all my invisible edges are now gone again. But I have this two triangles on the top. You really, occasionally, you really wouldn't want to do this too much unless you knew what you were doing and you had a very specific reason for it. Because it's quite messy. Like I said before, you haven't got all the tools. So if I go back up here, if I click on my polygon, see, I've got no tools to help me edit this. It becomes quite a cumbersome procedure to edit your mesh, very old school, and you really want it as an editable poly. You can flip between the two, like I said. So if I go here, I can change it back to an editable polygon, and now I have all my tools up here that I can use to edit my polygon. See, but now I've gone into mesh, change this edge to a visible edge. I can now extrude my triangles like so. And like I said before, I can't do that here. It doesn't let me. So there's no way I can. If I go to object properties, turn that off. You know, I can't select the invisible edges in polygon mode, and that's fine because I don't need to really. And if I do need to, I can drop into mesh mode like so. But like I said, be very careful if you do this, and you find some of your faces missing. It's like, oh, what's going on? It's because you've gone into mesh mode and come out again, and it treats it slightly differently. So I would say don't use it unless you're confident with what you're doing. So that's the basic difference between them all, really. I've changed this to editable mesh now, and it's letting me select my edges, my invisible edges. Even when you can't see them, you can select them in editable mesh mode. If I go and turn edges back on, see, I know that they're there, so I can see it's letting me select them. And I can edit them as well. You know, you can pull them about. But you know, it gets really messy. So I would avoid mesh mode unless you really have to. Unless I do it, which I may do actually on occasion when we're building objects, to drop into editable mesh and then drop back out again. Then just avoid it. Let's turn that back to poly mode. So in poly mode, I can no longer select my edges. Only the edges that I can see, the visible edges. So that's it. So that's a primitive. I've got no editable features or editable ability at all. That's poly mode, and it works purely with quads and what it calls polygons, but they are actually triangles, as I've just demonstrated. And you have mesh mode, which allows you to work on a triangle level basically, but without any sort of tools. Without any of the fancy polygon tools. Going forward in the course, we will primarily be using polygon mode, dipping into this occasionally and coming back out, but we'll always probably, I'd say, always start with a primitive. Of course, the other route in is if you're doing something big and organic like character, you would sculpt it in a sculpting package and bring that in also after it's been polygonized. But in this course, we're not going to do that. That's a separate course which I'm planning currently. Primitives, editable poly, editable mesh. These two we'll be using more than anything. So that's it. I hope that clears it up. If you have any questions about that, I know it can be a little bit confusing. Let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next lecture.